In our studio, we have Dr. Merissa Grant-Tate. Dr. Grant-Tate is an oncologist, and she's here to enlighten us on the human papillomavirus. Good morning, Dr. Tate, and welcome back to Good Morning SKN.
Good morning.
Happy you could join us this morning.
Indeed.
It's my pleasure.
Awesome.
What is HPV?
HPV, simply put, is a virus. There are over 200 or approximately 200 different subtypes or serotypes, as we would refer to them. What happens, though, is that they are then subcategorized into what we would refer to as high risk HPV virus and low risk. And according to their categorization, then we have a better understanding in terms of their capabilities.
Wow, you said over 200. I'm still in shock about this.
Interesting. Doctor, can you share with us how this virus is being transmitted?
Well, HPV is actually transmitted through sexual intercourse. However, and I know because generally when we hear of HPV, you know, we tend to go on the offensive. In actuality, HPV is in fact the most commonly transmitted sexually transmitted disease, specifically in the United States. But apart from that, worldwide in general, it's just extremely common. As a matter of fact, it is known that 9 out of 10 Americans by the age of 27 will have had, or will have, would have had, or have had what is HPV infection.
Wow. We know there's a campaign in the US with the vaccine.
Right.
From what I've read, it's a non-curable disease once it's caught. Do you know, or can you say if the vaccine prevents this virus from happening? And if so, why is it that we don't have the same campaign in our federation?
So that's 3 questions that I need to answer all at once. So the first part of it is, in actuality, it is curable, but it basically cures itself. It is an illness that passes on its own. Generally, the typical HPV infection would last approximately 2 years. And so then in terms of some of the more or the greater consequences associated to high-risk HPV infections, they are as a result of what would be prolonged or persistent HPV infections. In respect to what would be the vaccine itself, the vaccine does in fact protect, very well, so too, against the HPV infection. And yes, we in fact do have what is a very active campaign here against HPV. In actuality, the Ministry of Health, they would have embarked on what would have been a campaign where we actually started vaccinating school children in around what would have been the 5th grade to be able to have the vaccine. And that's some years now. That's about 3-4 years.
So around 12, 11 is the vaccination age?
Basically. From my best recollection, my daughter would have been about 9 at the time, but she was in 5th grade, and so she too was also vaccinated in what was the first batch. Yes.
And Dr. Tate, to my knowledge, signs and symptoms. Sign is basically what you see an individual, and the symptoms would be how you would feel. Can you share with us what are some of the signs and symptoms of the HPV?
Unfortunately, HPV too is pretty asymptomatic. So we do not have a whole lot in terms of signs or symptoms that you can typically refer to. And so it basically comes to, what is, I would say perhaps opportunistic testing to be able to confirm what would be the actual illness. But there
are no signs.
Truly, we cannot refer to any signs or symptoms.
So what about the cauliflower growth? Because we know there are other cauliflower growths that may not be HPV. That's why it's so important to get the diagnosis from a doctor. But isn't that a sign?
Well, technically, so here we've gotten a bit more complex because while they may be the result of HPV, they themselves are not HPV. Right. So right, and
Okay.
so
Learn
I'm
something
I'm
new.
sorry, I didn't intend to be technical, but
But it's good to know because
Right,
we
right,
weren't
right.
informed about that.
Right.
But, wow.
So you know, in terms of as I would have spoken before, in respect to what would be the high risk and the low risk, the low risk serotypes, they tend to cause what would be the warts and the growths and so forth. So this is where you would put in that cauliflower like aspect.
Okay.
And so then the high risk, then those types rather would be greater associated with what would be cancers. In other words, they are predisposing factors to quite a few cancers.
You said quite a few cancers. Could you name some of those cancers?
Sure, absolutely.
And I'm going to throw a next question at you since I like to throw questions.
Give me time to breathe.
Who is more effective, the male or the female?
Equally so. Equally so. There is no disparity. Right. There is no disparity as it would refer to HPV. HPV is simply HPV across the board in respect to incidence, and again too because of the fact that it is transmitted through sexual relations. It's also important to point out that the normal barrier methods, that and that is perhaps very important to point out because generally we tend to think, well, I'm being cautious, I'm being protective, and so forth. But in actuality, the barrier methods do not protect you against HPV.
Wow. So you cannot protect yourself.
I'm sorry.
So we cannot protect ourselves from it?
Well,
if we have it?
Well, in terms of contracting it, because of this, and so this is why people like myself, for example, we try to eliminate what is that stereotyping, that prejudice towards, what would be certain types of cancers specifically. For example, I always say, women, for example, who are diagnosed with breast cancer and so forth, and through no fault of their own, they often receive what is a much more sympathetic view and support in terms of the general public compared to when a woman is diagnosed with what is a cervical cancer, where it is then, it's as if to suggest, well, it's because of something that you did, right? Amongst other things. But in actuality, the truth of the matter is that, generally, once it is that you are in fact sexually active, 9 out of 10 possibilities is that, or chances rather, would have been that you would have contracted HPV at some point in your life, very likely before the age of 27.
This is shocking.
Yes.
It is
I
shocking.
know, right?
And in terms of prevalence, is it prevalent here in St. Kitts?
All over, everywhere. Again, it's just associated to what is sexual activity, and again, because of the fact that the barrier methods do not protect you against HPV infections, then it really comes down in terms of consequence and symptoms, or rather not symptoms, but more so in terms of outcomes. To a large extent, would depend on other factors. Specifically, your immune system, that is one of the best factors in terms of being able to naturally allow for what is the elimination of the HPV virus. Because contrary to that, we do not have what is going to be an otherwise cure. So the body has to be able to eliminate it on its own.
The cure.
Absolutely.
Basically. You touched on cancers, doctor. I know cervical is one. I was also reading something, so you can tell me if it's incorrect. The papillomavirus can cause stomach cancer as well. Have you heard of that?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was like, it says it can cause some. That's the organs that it affects and cause it to be cancerous. I said I definitely have to ask you when you see why you don't believe everything you read on the internet?
Exactly.
Dr. Google. But
that's why we bring in the experts.
Exactly.
Right.
But it definitely does, lead to, greater propensity to other types of cancers, specifically what we'd refer to as anogenital cancers.
Okay.
So basically anything from what is the anus, that of the vagina, and so forth. Also, too, it can cause cancers of the oropharynx, it can cause cancers of the mouth. Oropharynx, that's that little space heading back in from the mouth.
Okay, because I was just lost.
And to some extent as well too in terms of the throat. So I'm not sure if maybe that may have been what you may have read, because
No, it says
sometimes we
something
tend
with the
to
stomach.
okay,
Yeah,
no,
it said the papilloma. It didn't say the human. It said the
right.
papillomavirus affects the stomach and it causes cancers.
No, more specifically though, H. pylori does have a high association in terms of a predisposing factor for cancer of the stomach, but that's the H. pylori.
And it's different
okay.
from HPV.
That's different to
okay,
HPV,
okay.
which is the
Okay.
human papillomavirus.
Right.
Indeed.
And doctor, can you share with us, is there a difference in which it affects male or female?
Not at all. Similarly, in terms of the incidence, men similarly can end up with, what may be the cancers as a result of the high risk sub or serotypes.
Okay.
They can equally as the women. And in terms of the low risk serotypes, the same in terms of what would be the warts and so forth. The difference I would say would be more in terms of anatomical, in the sense that men do not have cervix, cervix or a cervix, right?
Right.
And so then a man would not be affected by cervical cancer, which is actually, now considered an international problem of health by the World Health Organization and by the International Agency for Cancer Research.
Okay, you can bust the next myth for me. So I read something else that says it takes 10 to 15 years for those persons who may have the HPV for the cancer to develop. Doc, is that true?
It's variable, to be quite honest. We tend to look at what would be averages in terms of the progression of the illness, or rather of what would have been the HPV infection. But there definitely are some variations in terms of what would be the sexually or rather of the sexual organs in respect to that of the cervix and so forth. Generally, we tend to recommend that testing begins from at least 5 years after the onset of sexual relations, the first or the initial onset. Just to be able to emphasize more on what would be pre-cancer detection, which is very important, and that is perhaps one of the more underused services here, and it's something that we need to work towards more greatly so.
You mean women going for the pap smears?
Absolutely, absolutely.
But some women are still afraid because it's not that comfortable.
But in actuality, I mean, if we have to compare, cervical cancer to what is, a pap smear,
right.
And to be quite honest, even so to at this point in time, IARC, and again with WHO IARC, they are actually advocating for what would be instead the emphasis on what would be the HPV vaccination. So there's this 90-70 approach that is being used, and countries are being encouraged to adapt. 90% of girls, or rather of children, to have been vaccinated with the HPV vaccine. For 70% of women, this is for the elimination of cervical cancer. For 70% of women to have had what we would refer to as a high quality testing method, which will not in fact be the pap smear. In this instance, we're referring to what would be colposcopy, that is, one method, or what is the HPV testing specifically. And the recommendations for that would be that it is done first at the age of 35, and that it is done again at the age of 45. And then the 90%, the other 90% is in respect to what is treatment. And this is for what is the elimination of cervical cancer worldwide.
Wow.
And this is for both men and women.
Well, because of the fact that men do not have the cervix, but they definitely can assist. They definitely can assist.
Right.
Let me ask you, what about foods and vitamins and stuff? What food should we eat? What food should we not eat? What vitamins should we take to ensure that we don't contract the HPV or help
No such thing again, in terms of, to be quite honest, no such thing. And I hate to be the break of sad news. No such
I'm
thing.
trying here.
But again, because of the fact that the body naturally has, its own mechanism in terms of being able to eliminate the HPV virus, then what we do encourage would be, healthy lifestyles in terms of, definitely the vitamins help, but I always try to emphasize, even for children, on what would be a more complete diet. And where it is that you have these deficiencies, then, you may be able to rely on vitamins. So no specific vitamin or anything of that sort. But if there is a deficiency for whatever reason, then by all means.
Okay. All right.
So, quickly, doctor, you go into the medical facility, you've been tested for HPV. Walk us through, if you diagnosed them, walk us through the treatment procedure.
Again, no treatment. They're right. No treatment. I thought. What happens is that for HPV, we are literally relying on our own immune system, our body, to be able to eliminate it. There's no treatment. There's no such thing. And to be fair, I always highlight or try to highlight rather the fact that we still have many challenges in general worldwide when it comes to what would be treating viruses. Viruses are not easy to treat. And so then HPV is no different. This is why, we still have, what would be, issues with other virally transmitted illnesses, such as HIV, which then ultimately, can result in AIDS, and so forth. Viruses are difficult.
That has a treatment.
There's treatment in terms of suppression, but in respect to what is curation, then it's right. And
so HPV is inevitable.
Once you're sexually active, it's pretty difficult for you to dodge the bullet. And so this is why, again, we emphasize on the methods in respect to elimination of, the cancers that are more profound. In 2020, there were over 500,000 new cases of cervical cancer worldwide. And then there would have been approximately 350,000 deaths of that same year. And most of those deaths would have been in small or rather underdeveloped or countries in route of development and so forth. So it's definitely a problem, and at the same time one that can be quite avoided.
Okay.
Wow. And as we wrap, Dr. Tate, can you share with the viewing audience that individual who may have been diagnosed, what encouragement would you have for those persons who have contracted the HPV virus?
It really just comes down again to what would be, the necessary review in respect of knowing what what your risks are. It's very unlikely, in fact, that you be told, except if it is that you submit yourself specifically for what is going to be HPV testing. For example, we don't, there's no blood test, for example, for what is, say, HPV. So it's not one of those things that, very often you'll be told, oh, you have HPV. In absence of what would be a woman who would have gone to have done, whether it be her pap smear or specifically what is HPV testing, and then in that moment, then she is swabbed. So, it really just comes down to a matter of being able to monitor, so that we can check and make sure that the virus would have cleared itself within the time that it is supposed to. And in absence of that, if there's persistence of the illness, then to have the necessary review, looking for what could be the secondary results.